Welcome back to a new episode of Podcast on the Brink. It's Monday, October 28th. We got the busiest man in podcasting with us this week, Galen Clavio of CrimsonCast. Before we get to Galen, I want to quickly tell you a little bit about this week's sponsor for Podcast on the Brink. Visit Bloomington, who's also a proud partner of Indiana University Athletics. Right now, Visit Bloomington is giving you and one friend the chance to score free Hoosier basketball tickets. Go to visitbloomington.com/contests and enter the IU men's basketball giveaway. The winners will also receive a free gift card to Buccetto's Pizza and Pasta. The website, once again, visitbloomington.com/contests. Terms and conditions apply. See site for details. Galen, you told me before I hit record here, we chatted for, I think, 30 seconds because you were coming from another meeting, and I know you're busy, so I wanted to get this started as quickly as possible. But 7 podcasts last week, 5 scheduled for this week. How are you finding the time for this?
I mean, I'm not going to lie. I'm not finding the time for it. You got to just kind of squeeze these things in when you can. But it's kind of like if you've ever followed CrimsonCast during a basketball coaching change, which I've done a few of now. This is when people want to hear about IU sports. This is when people want to hear conversation about it. They're interested in what's going on. And I feel like it's my responsibility as somebody who's been in the space for a while, who's talked with people and who people, for whatever reason seem to enjoy listening to sometimes. Like, I got to dive in and do it fully. And IU football right now is a huge story. It's a national story. IU basketball's back. And I think a lot of people are going to be gradually more interested, especially after what happened this past weekend. So it's a sacrifice, but one I'm willing to make because this is when it's the most fun.
I mean, you're one of the diehards in terms of IU football. I mean, you've been doing this through a lot of dire seasons, a lot of seasons where there was very little interest. Have you been able to just take like a minute to kind of appreciate the moment that we're in? I mean, people have asked Kurt Signetti that, but I'm and obviously, you're not involved in it at the level of a coach at IU football, but you've been doing this a long time, and this is obviously just a moment that I think a lot of people thought would never happen. I'm just curious kind of how you've been able to appreciate this from a fan perspective.
I think most of the appreciation for me has come in the times that I'm at the games. And I've been fortunate in that I've been able to go to every game home and away so far this year. And that, I think being able to see it, being able to interact with it, being able to kind of feel the vibe and the emotion as it's going on has been about as good as anything. Because as I've tried to tell people on CrimsonCast with our football shows, I don't think there's a good way to explain in the moment what's going on with IU football. This is not just a unique story with IU football, and it is plenty unique historically, as we know. This is a unique story in college football history. Like, this is one of the most improbable turnarounds in a short period of time we've ever seen in the game in one season. So I've taken to having this refrain where I'm like, I'm not gonna try to explain what's going on. I'm just going to try to enjoy the moment, enjoy the feeling. And at some point, I'm sure my thoughts will coalesce around what it all means and how we got here and where it may be going. But my advice to all IU football fans or people that are interested in hopping on the bandwagon, we don't know how long the ride will last. They could lose this weekend to Michigan State. They could lose next week, or they could not lose at all. So enjoy it while it's happening, because it's already one of the top 4 or 5 greatest seasons in the entire history of the program, and it could be much more special than that.
I encourage everybody to make sure that you're subscribed to CrimsonCast. Galen and Scott do a tremendous job, not only with the football coverage, but basketball coverage all season long. So wherever you listen to your podcast, make sure you're subscribed to those guys. Like I said, I've said this many times. They've been in this game longer than anybody. They do a great job, and I would definitely appreciate your support. But we're obviously not here to talk football today, Galen. I did want to get your thoughts open up, but there was an important basketball scrimmage yesterday, exhibition, if you will. I actually made the drive down to Tennessee to get a glimpse of the Hoosiers in person for the first time. I know you watched most of the game yesterday. What were maybe your first impression thoughts of Indiana yesterday down in Knoxville, picking up the 66-62 win?
So a couple of things stuck out. Before even like talking about the specifics of the game, the football season's made it so I was not yet emotionally prepared to really jump into watching basketball. And it really took a lot for me to get my head wrapped around the fact that basketball was on and that it was a game that, I mean, we've had so many years of these not very entertaining exhibition games against D2 teams, or, back when I was in school, we were playing like the Outback All-Stars or whatever. It's like, how do you get excited about that? But this was cool. I was originally supposed to go down to the game. The game day thing being in Bloomington made it so I couldn't go down, but my sister was down there. It was really cool to see Indiana in a live action environment with fans, and there were a lot of IU fans there. I was pleasantly surprised at most of what I saw from this IU team, and I was at Hoosier Hysteria last week, and the scrimmage, I didn't know what to take out of it. Like, it was hard to get a sense of anything. And, and a lot of that's because you've got, the mixed rosters with, good guys on both teams. So it was interesting to kind of see what might be the approach offensively. And I think what stuck out to me was Indiana did look like at times it was trying to push the tempo. And so that was good. B, the fact that they took as many threes as they took was really encouraging. And yes, they missed all of them in the first half, but it's an exhibition game in October in an arena that none of them have ever played in before. I'm not going to get too worked up about that. And I'll note that, Indiana percentage-wise shot almost as poorly from three as Tennessee did. I think a lot of that is just where we are in the season. And I don't know how you watched that game and didn't get immediately excited about Miles Rice and Omar Ballo. I mean, Rice, I hate to keep using Yogi Ferrell as the example, but I think he's probably already, he looks like the best guard Indiana's had since Yogi Ferrell, certainly the most promising athletically, really seems to have a mindset for the game that IU fans will love and that IU as a team is needed. And Ballo, I think I said this in the spring when he got signed, this is the type of player IU never gets. I can never remember a player of this athletic skill and his physical stature. This is the type of player that plays at Michigan or at Ohio State. It's not the type of player that we generally get here. And so that was exciting. And certainly I love the fact that with all of the new additions, Malik Renew came out and scored 21 points, led the team, hit a key three down the stretch right when Indiana needed it. And I love the fact that Mackenzie Mbako, hit a couple of threes and played as many minutes as he did. So, all told, you can't take a whole lot out of it. And if Indiana had lost the game, we'd be scurrying around on social media saying, well, it's only an exhibition. You can't take anything from it. So I do want to apply that same kind of logic to winning. But I think if you're an IU fan looking for change, and many IU fans are in that category, there was a whole lot to like with what you saw on Sunday.
Yeah, one of the biggest things I took from it, and you're right, it was a great crowd. There was a ton of IU fans there, but it was, 80% Tennessee fans, and there was a pretty good atmosphere there. I'm not going to say it was, going to the Breslin Center in February atmosphere, going to Mackey Arena in late January atmosphere, but there was Tennessee fans there. They were making their presence felt, and you knew like late down the stretch when Indiana got that 6-point lead that it wasn't just going to be easy sailing from there. And the fact that Indiana was able to kind of close the game out, that's something that they've had so much trouble with over the years, not just under Mike Woodson. So many coaches, Indiana going back, it's Big Ten road wins have been, a sore subject for Indiana fans for a long time. And this obviously wasn't a game that actually counted in the standings, but to me, it was impressive for them to be able to kind of weather that storm late and finish the game. Wasn't pretty, as you mentioned. They shot a lot of threes and didn't make a really high percentage, but I think it's valuable to go on the road, whether it be an exhibition or not, and figure out a way to win and prevail in an atmosphere like that. I think that can be something that can really help this team moving forward.
I echo all of that. And I'll just note, like, defensively, this is the area where actually Indiana needs the most work. I would argue, the offense, certainly there's a lot to be done there. I think some of that with the incoming players will sort itself out just in better shot taking and better ability to get into the paint. But, you hold Tennessee to no field goals in the last 4 minutes of the game, essentially. You turn Tennessee over 15 times throughout the course of the game. You hold them to 8 for 35 shooting from distance. I mean, those are things that you can say, okay, this is where we start with our defensive effort. If we can maintain this throughout the course of the early part of the season while we round ourselves into shape, like that's good. And when I think about what you can take out of these sorts of things, to be able to play against a live opponent and to be able to play in an exciting environment and to have that as a measuring stick, which you're not really going to get even in the first few games that you're playing. I mean, Indiana plays South Carolina, like the third weekend of November. That's a long time between, opponents that have a pulse, I guess I would say. And so I like the fact that now they've got that taste. They'll be able to walk away from that. Luke Goody's going to shoot better, I think, when we see him next time. And, Gabe Cup's got some run, which was nice. They did all this without Trey Galloway, and he'll be back on the floor. So that'll change things a little bit for the better. But yeah, all of that together really does matter. And I do think that it provides Indiana with the possibility of saying we're going to round ourselves into shape in these areas. Now we know where we were deficient. There were a lot of missed layups. There were some little things that you would want to work on, but now there's film, like a real good looking film in a different arena as opposed to just film that's coming from Cook Hall. I think that helps out quite a bit.
One thing I feel like every year we kind of fall in the trap of talking about depth with Indiana basketball. And last year, I think a lot of people kind of, thought mistakenly that Caleb Banks and CJ Gunn were going to miraculously, I guess, develop over the course of the offseason and become quality depth. As we saw it play out, that didn't happen. When you kind of look at this roster, you mentioned Trey Galloway not being out there. You didn't even mention Bryson Tucker, who's a McDonald's All-American, didn't play yesterday. Ja'Kai Newton, who knows when or if we'll see him play this season, but he's another guy I think that has a chance to at least impact some things with his athleticism and his strength as a guard. Is this just in terms of quality depth? Looking back maybe to Crean's teams, at least on paper, is this the best in terms of quality, like 1 to 8 or 9 that Indiana's had, maybe since that Big Ten championship team that Crean had?
I think so. I think that's a pretty reasonable thing to say. I mean, it's a deeper team than what they had in 22-23 even. That was a very top-heavy team. And look, I think this is where, as much as IU fans get caught up in recruiting rankings and get caught up in recruiting success, and certainly I'm not trying to say those things aren't important, but to be able to look at your roster and say, okay, we brought in from outside a starting center, a starting point guard, a starting, or maybe sixth man sort of swing man, a guy who can come in and give you minutes in the paint, and then another guard, all of whom have got Division I experience at a decently high level, and those get added to the players that were coming back. I really do think that makes a big difference in terms of depth. And look, for a variety of reasons, a lot of the depth pieces that Indiana has had on their rosters just haven't developed. They haven't executed over the course of the last 7 or 8 years. And some of that's bad luck. No one anticipated Jerome Hunter's body deciding to just quit on him. Nobody expected CJ Gunn, for instance, to not develop into the player that everybody thought he was going to be coming out of high school. It's not all like Indiana's fault. Whatever the reason, though, you've got so many people who have already demonstrated that they can play at the Division I level on this roster, and they join, players that came back like Malik Renew, like Mackenzie Mbako and Trey Galloway, who gave you major minutes last year. So it is really exciting. I do agree with you. Like, we get way too caught up in the depth thing. The ninth man does not really matter except in very limited circumstances, particularly with the way that this team plays, where, its rotations are generally so top heavy. You look back at last year and, you get down to like, your ninth man last year in terms of statistical contributions was, maybe it was CJ Gunn, maybe it was Caleb Banks, it was Anthony Walker. I mean, that's the caliber of player that you were dealing with then. I think you could say that any of those guys out, on the outflow are being replaced by players who have a better chance at contributing in the Big Ten Conference than what you got out of them.
Yeah, I think the one area where the depth really does come in is when you have an injury like last season where Xavier Johnson was out, and then all of a sudden you have Gabe Cup starting, I think, over 20 games, playing 20 minutes a game. Clearly wasn't ready. You look at it this year and you say, Galloway comes back, Bryson Tucker's healthy. Who knows with Ja'Kai Newton? I don't know realistically how many minutes that Anthony Leal and Gabe Cupps are even going to get against quality teams. And I think that kind of speaks to maybe where this roster is this season compared to where it was last year. What are your biggest questions about this team as the season starts? Obviously, don't think we're going to learn a ton against Friday against Marion, and I think it's SIU, Edwardsville, and Eastern Illinois are the first 2 regular season games. I would hope that Indiana beats those teams by 30 and 40 and tries to go ahead and start, padding their metrics a little bit as opposed to what we saw last season. I've kind of been beating that drum here in the preseason, but maybe we don't learn a lot about this team until the South Carolina game. But what are the questions that you kind of have about this group entering the season?
I think my biggest questions are a little more on the macro scale. I mean, first and foremost, so Mike Woodson's been the coach now for 3 full seasons. First year, his offense was 95th in the country in efficiency, according to Ken Pom. His second year was 28th in the country. Now, that was largely Trace Jackson Davis, but it was also, there were other contributors. Jalen Hood-Schifino, even though he didn't have a great season from an efficiency perspective, certainly provided a lot in terms of assists. Last year, the offense drops back down to 105th. It's got to get up into the 30s, if not better, if Indiana is going to be a national contender. And I do worry, like even with Trace Jackson Davis, Indiana only had the 28th most efficient offense in the country. And what that really comes down to, again, is the lack of 3-point shooting, the lack of emphasis. Like you get, Alex, I learned this over the summer. You get more points from a 3-pointer than you do off of a 2-pointer. You've got to have statistically that be part of what your offense is doing. And so getting that efficiency number up, scoring more points per possession, you've either got to shoot more threes or you've got to be hyper efficient from 2. And I think they've got the personnel to do those things either way or both, ideally. But I need to see it happen. I think it's where a lot of IU fans are. They have, for better or for worse, fair or unfair, Mike Woodson and his staff earned a lot of goodwill with IU fans with the way that the offense struggled. And yes, I know you lose your point guard, that's tough. And it's kind of like losing a quarterback in some ways. It's like if you lose your starting quarterback in the NFL, you're probably not going to be able to bring somebody in that can do nearly as good of a job. But you probably shouldn't just have one functional point guard at this level because injuries happen. We've seen injuries happen a bunch in the history of IU basketball. I've always felt like the excuse that, we didn't have Xavier Johnson, so therefore we should be excused from what we did on offense, which kind of felt like what the message was at the end of last season. This is Indiana. This is the Big Ten. That doesn't fly. So I think Woodson and his staff deserve the leeway of being able to fix it. But it is going to require that they change their approach, not just in terms of having a healthy point guard out there, but in terms of what the offense is doing, which is to some degree why I thought the Tennessee game was a cause for optimism. Because you could see what the offense would look like, both in terms of making the pace a little bit faster and also in terms of trying to incorporate the 3-point shot more significantly into what they're doing. The other thing, though, and it sounds dumb because I just said, they need to improve the offense. That's one of the big picture items. But the other is this team's got to be better defensively. They were 84th in the country in defensive efficiency last year. They weren't that great defensively in the previous year. That 23 season, they were only 45th in the country in defensive efficiency, which again, that'll get you in the tournament, but that's not going to get you past the first, maybe the second round. Like maybe you win a first round game, but you cannot afford to go out there and be giving up, a point plus per possession consistently against average teams, because when you face the good teams in the NCAA tournament, they're going to eat your lunch, which is kind of what happened in the last 10 minutes of that Miami game where, Indiana just stopped being able to get stops. So I don't know what happened last year in terms of the defense not being able to tighten the screws. It's a lot of it came down to not defending the 3 as well as they could have. They were 211th in the country in 3-point percentage allowed. They were 48th in the country in opponent percentage of points coming from 3-pointers. So a lot of it's perimeter based, and this is probably where like Miles Rice and Cannon Carlisle and Trey Galloway to some degree are going to make their biggest impacts, is in keeping opponents from getting high efficiency shots that are going to hurt Indiana's defensive efficiency. So again, it's a stylistic change to some degree, but I think here it's like, can Indiana find whatever secret sauce they had that first year that Woodson was here when really the defense kept them afloat? can they translate that into something that's going to work over the course of a full season now that we have essentially all Woodson's players in there, with the exception, I guess, of Galloway and Leal?
Yeah, the one thing that I kind of keep coming back to is the rebounding from last year. And I've mentioned this on previous podcasts, and people are probably getting tired of hearing it, but for Indiana last season, I believe they were sub 200 in both. I think you have the numbers right in front of you, but I don't. But sub 200 in defensive rebounding percentage and offensive rebounding percentage. To me, that was really hard to understand just based on the size that Indiana continuously put on the court. I think they had the fourth tallest team in the country. And to be that poor of a rebounding team, it obviously wasn't because they weren't big enough. It was because maybe they didn't emphasize it enough on both ends. And one of the things that the players have talked about a lot, media day, and we saw it last night. I was impressed with how they rebounded the ball against Tennessee to hold their own against Tennessee. I'm not sure that they're number 12 in the country. Based on what I saw last night, they're obviously working through some things, but I know they're going to be a really good team. They've been a top 5 defensive team the last 4 seasons under Rick Barnes. They're going to be one of the top teams in the SEC. But for Indiana to go out there last night and rebound the ball like they did, I thought that was a step in the right direction. How important do you think it is for Indiana to, boost those numbers significantly on both ends of the floor defensively, in terms of defensive and offensive rebounding percentage, to kind of reach their ceiling as a team?
It's a great question. I mean, I've been disappointed in the rebounding numbers ever since Mike Woodson got back. I mean, because it wasn't just last year. Like, they really were not a great rebounding team on either side of the ball, even when Trace Jackson Davis was there. Now, some of that was because of how they were using Davis. But here's the thing. I think your listeners are mostly aware of this. If you're a believer in advanced statistics in basketball, there are 4 factors that matter the most in terms of contributing to success. There's how well you shoot the ball, how often you turn the ball over, how often you rebound the basketball, and how often you get to the free throw line. And then the converse of those things on the defensive end. For whatever reason, Mike Woodson and his staff up to this point have seemed to de-emphasize offensive and defensive rebounding as important within those factors. Now, I don't know if they're thinking that way, because there is, and this is where it's like, there are no absolutes in basketball. You can be a pretty mediocre rebounding team if you're not turning the basketball over and if you're limiting your opponent's shots. That's not what Indiana did last year. In addition to not rebounding the ball well, Indiana was really, really poor in terms of turning the ball over themselves, and also they barely forced any turnovers. They were one of the worst teams in the country in forcing opponents' turnovers. And, the remedial lesson on this for the listeners that aren't aware is the reason, all of these things come down to possession control. How many possessions do you have the ability to score points on? How many possessions are you limiting your opponent's ability to score? A defensive rebound ends your opponent's possession. An offensive rebound extends your possession and therefore your ability to score on it. So the way that IU has played, they basically only focused on shooting percentage. They have been, to their credit, very good at both high field goal percentages on their offensive end, because they take so many twos, which are generally higher percentage shots, and limiting their opponents to their own field goal percentage. The problem is, if you're letting a bunch of offensive rebounds up, your opponent is automatically going to have a lower shooting percentage, but they're going to have more shots per possession. And that is ultimately the big flaw if you just look at the numbers in terms of how Indiana's tried to approach this stuff. And so I think you can do both. There's no reason why Indiana can't be a team that generates turnovers and hangs on to the basketball better. And I'm really fascinated to see how Miles Rice handles being a point guard, and, how good will he be in terms of what he's able to do, hanging on to the basketball, putting pressure on the opponent, making sure that, that part of things is being shored up. Last year, Rice was, if you look at his overall numbers, he turned the ball over on 18% of possessions, and he was on a Washington State team that was really bad at forcing turnovers. So I am a little bit concerned about that, but I'm willing to see what goes on with all of this, because, one of the reasons Washington State didn't focus on turnovers was they were really good at rebounding the ball offensively, and defensively for that matter. So all of that to say, there's no reason why a team that's starting a 7-footer and a 6'10" guy with the size that Indiana's got shouldn't rebound the ball well on both ends. And if they're not going to, fine, but you better shore up those other areas, because otherwise you're leaving a big potential like efficiency saver out of your equation altogether.
Yeah, the other problem with the offense has been it's been built to get to the free throw line, and then Indiana gets to the free throw line very well, and then they can't make the free throws. So then it's like, it's two step forward, one step forward, two steps back in that sense.
It's odd too, because I mean, yeah, you're that good as Indiana is at getting to the free throw line. 58th in the country last year in terms of ratio. They really didn't do it that much the previous year, but they were really good in Woodson's first year. And yet, this has been a problem since, Archie Miller took over. Indiana just hasn't been able to consistently shoot free throws at a high enough percentage. Even the year they made the tournament and went to the second round, they were 200th in the country in free throw percentage. They were 333rd last year. It's like everything fell off a cliff from that perspective. Is that a coaching thing? Is it a mentality thing? Is it some combination therein? I almost feel like so much of this IU program, the big concept items are not necessarily wrong. The way that Mike Woodson says he wants to play on offense especially can work, but it requires an attention to detail that Indiana has not seemed to exhibit on the floor for most of the 3 seasons that Woodson's been the coach. They want to get to the free throw line. That's good. That's one of the 4 factors. But if you can't hit your free throws, it's the least important of the 4 factors. Like, I'd rather they spend all of their time trying to get rebounds and trying to force turnovers. They want to be efficient in terms of shooting. That's good. But if all you're doing is shooting 2s and your opponent is shooting 3s, you're spotting them a 5 to 7 point advantage before the game even starts, simply because 3s are worth more than 2s. So, even the rebounding thing, a lot of it, as I go back through my mental Rolodex to the various games where this was a problem last year, a lot of the rebounding issues felt like that's not something I'm going to focus on. It's not something I'm giving a huge amount of effort to. And that ended up being consistently what you saw throughout most of the roster. If you look at the offensive and defensive rebounding rates, like Khalil Ware was like legitimately a great rebounder on the defensive side. He was 30th in the country in rebounding percentage. Nobody else cracked the top 500 on the team. Well,
right.
That's and then now you start to question, well, this is a guy that just came in as a transfer. Why aren't the guys who are at the core of this IU team focusing more and more tenacious and more aggressive in the rebounding space? So that is, again, and I think a lot of IU fans, I guess, are ambivalent, I think, about the season in a way that I have not seen for such a talented team on paper in a long time. IU fans aren't stupid. And, even if they don't necessarily look at the advanced metrics that closely, most of them would probably recount similar issues that they're having with watching this team play. And I don't think that Woodson, and Woodson doesn't necessarily need to do this, but I think it would go a long way towards reestablishing some goodwill. I think he needs to talk a little more ball with the fan base and explain why things are happening or not happening. Because in lieu of that, it just seems like they don't care to focus on things that IU fans know intrinsically are important. And it's not like IU fans are wrong. They're just looking at what's going on in the rest of college basketball. And they're saying, well, those teams shoot 3s regularly and hit them. Those teams get rebounds regularly. Those teams force turnovers regularly and don't turn the ball over themselves. Why aren't we? And there really hasn't been a lot of delving into why that is, other than, well, our point guard got injured last year. Well, it's like, I think there needs to, it's a systematic thing. Explain the system. If it's not, fine. But then there has to be something. Like, you can't, I don't think at the one hand you can constantly laud IU fans for knowing so much about basketball, and on the other hand act like they are incapable of understanding the basics, or at least to the point where you don't feel like you need to explain what's going on. So I don't know. I'm endlessly fascinated with the scenarios that this team has in front of it, because this is legitimately, it's a team that could win the Big Ten title. It's a team that has the pieces to get to a Final Four. That I don't necessarily know that either of those is going to happen, but all of the pieces are there. And yet, even with that, there's a real ambivalence about how to approach this team from a fan perspective, because I think people felt really burned by how January, February, March happened last year. it felt very Archie Miller-ish, and that's not where anybody wants to be mentally at this point.
Were you surprised at just how quickly the goodwill was lost with a portion of the fan base?
Yeah, I was. And I think back on that period a lot, like that whole period from mid-January to, that run they went on at the end of the regular season that culminated in the win at home versus Michigan State. I mean, this is where it's tough as a podcaster. And you know this from doing this and certainly writing about it every game. There's a spot in between unquestioned support of the coach and the team and the coach needs to be fired. And certainly there are injury-related items that you could look at last year where and also developmental issues, where you could look at it and say, well, things just didn't coalesce with that roster. They didn't come together the way that they should have. And I think that the problem is this fan base has been, I think they felt like they've been led around by the nose with IU basketball for a long time in terms of they keep getting promised, not progress, but like the achievement of a higher plane of basketball, and they're not getting it. And I think as things started to devolve last year, when you put it in the framework of Purdue is the best team in the country for January and February, and they end up going to a national title game, they lose to UConn, who seems to be using kind of a modified version of how Bob Knight would have put a team together 20 some years ago. They just win 2 back-to-back titles. Like it wasn't just the performance of the team, it was also the context in which that was occurring in. And it just, I think for a lot of fans, they are kind of hair trigger right now, especially in a Big Ten that wasn't that strong. I mean, people forget, like only 6 teams made the tournament last year out of the Big Ten. And of those 6, 3 of them were an 8 seed or worse. So it wasn't even like it was a particularly strong Big Ten. And the fact that you couldn't pull it together there, the fact you lose the big games that you played, you lose the home game to Kansas, you lose the game in Madison Square Garden to UConn. It just kind of felt like, God, we are like a second or third tier basketball program right now. And so I do think some of the reaction was overreaction. I do think some of it was unfair to Woodson and the coaching staff because, look, they did get to the tournament 2 years in a row, the 2 previous years. They have upped the caliber of athlete that they've been able to bring in at the top end. And there has been some pride restored to the program, minimal, but still pride restored compared to the morass that existed not just during the Archie Miller years, but, Crean missed the tournament 2 out of the last 4 years he was here. It wasn't like, things were all coming up rainbows at that point either. But the flip side is, I think what made it worse last year was questions being asked about what was going on with the program were met with almost a, how dare you? Not a, we acknowledge things are not going right and we're upset about it too and we're trying to fix it. And that really, I think, amped up what would have been just regular level discontent into a furor. I mean, we got Trilly Donovan in his Discord saying that, like, Woodson's getting fired. We got, the candidates being sounded out. It doesn't sound like any of that was ultimately going to happen. Who knows what was going on behind closed doors, but it really did kind of feel like what could have been just a regular, God, this season sucks. Why is it happening? Why can't we get better reaction? And it turned into something that kind of fed on itself in a very negative way. And I think we're still kind of living in that right now. Like it to some degree, I think explains a lot of the ambivalence that we're seeing.
Last thing I wanted to ask you about is just, and this is kind of goes back to what you're saying. It's kind of hard to thread the needle as someone who writes about the team or talks about the team on a podcast in terms of expectations, right? Because you have a set of people who say, well, if they don't make the second weekend of the tournament or they don't finish at the top of the Big Ten, then there should be a change. And then the other people say, well, Woodson should get much, as long a time he needs to kind of figure it out. And he's obviously made the tournament, and 2 of the 3 years he makes the tournament again, it's hard to move on from a coach like that. How do you, as someone who's followed IU basketball as long as you have, you've seen, the highest of highs, you've seen the lowest of lows. How do you, as a fan, enter a season and say what the expectation should be for a particular season? Because I think it's really hard to say, Indiana needs to finish top 3 in the Big Ten, or they should move on from Mike Woodson, or Indiana needs to make it to the Sweet 16. So I'm just curious how you come to a conclusion on that, or if you even think about it in that way.
This is a tough one. I mean, what is the goal of Indiana right now as a basketball program? I don't know. Like, does Indiana want to be a team that wins the Big Ten? Would winning the Big Ten, does that resonate the same way that it used to in a Big Ten when you don't play a round robin schedule? I mean, there's some cachet in that, certainly. And I would love to be able to say, hey, we won the Big Ten last year. But Indiana wants to judge itself on the national stage. They want to judge themselves in the tournament. And, we've seen, like, you can be a lower seeded team and make a run in the tournament. But it requires things to kind of go your way in terms of the draw and just in terms of what sort of skills you've got. For me, I think a successful season is, can IU stay in the national conversation as a ranked team? Can they get ranked first? Which means they got to have a good Atlantis, because that's really their only way that they're going to get ranked before the conference schedule starts. And then from there, can they put themselves in position to be one of the top 16 teams in the country, get one of those protected seeds, and at the very least get to a Sweet 16? I couldn't help but chuckle as Woodson is talking to our friend Trisha Whitaker on Hoosier Hysteria Day, and he's like, all I got left to do is win a Big Ten title and a national title. And I'm like, that's a weird way of putting that, because I don't know how attainable a national title is for this team. It's not out of the question, but it seems unlikely given the relative levels of talent they have compared to the teams that are actual national title contenders. But a Big Ten title is, in this Big Ten, I think, certainly attainable. And a Big Ten title sets you up for a potential second weekend run or beyond in the NCAA tournament. And so for me, it's like, all right, if we're going to give a mulligan on the 2023-24 season, well, you still got to hit the next shot. And so this is the next shot. And I think going out and having a repeat of the 22-23 season, where you finish second in the conference and you lose in the second round of the NCAA tournament by double digits, I don't think that's enough. I mean, at that point, it's like, well, we're better than we were under Archie, and we're, I guess, more consistent than we were under Crean, in that you will have made the tournament 3 times in 4 years. But you're A, not where you say you want to be as a program, and B, are you getting better at that point? Like, really, because you may have this nucleus, or at least part of this nucleus, next year, and that would be good. But I do think then you start to ask yourself, like, are you standing still, or are you figuring out a way to move it forward? And so I try not to put expectations on seasons ahead of time, other than to say, when I run through the schedule, how's this going to equate? What should it look like? I mean, last year I remember doing projections before the year, and I was way off on a lot of the teams I thought were going to do well, and not accurate on the teams that weren't. But I think with Indiana, there's nothing about this schedule that's overwhelming. There's no opponent on their schedule that they can't beat. And it's time now to start beating those teams. I mean, Mike Woodson, over the course of his first 3 years, is 21-14, 23-12, and 19-14. I would love it when Indiana, can you lose single digit games for a season? Is that a possibility? Can you finish the regular season with 8 losses? That'd be a nice start. And then you see where you go from there. But as far as what the ceiling on this team is, I don't think any of us are really going to be able to say. It's going to take a lot more of seeing this team in action and what the game plan is before we can really make that determination.
Galen, thanks for carving out some time. What's ahead this week on CrimsonCast?
We got some special interviews coming up. I won't spoil the surprise on a couple of them. We've got our regulars, Bison Chat, going to be, I think, Bison Chat after dark on Tuesday of this week as we break down the upcoming game against Michigan State. We got our preview Thursday night with Taylor Lehman, and then I'm heading up to East Lansing. I'll be up there for the game, so I'll be giving some eyewitness reports. So follow us on X, and you'll probably see those there. So
do you plan on being at every game here throughout the end of the season?
I feel like I have to, Alex. Like, I feel like this is the fact that the last 2 road games are in East Lansing and in Columbus, both of which are easy drives from Bloomington. And, when Indiana inevitably is in the Big Ten title game, that's right up the road. And that'll, wherever the bowl game is, I was going to be there anyway. So I think if I can pull off running the table on this, I never once did I think I would attend every IU football game in a season. This team is special enough that I'm excited to do it.
Well, we're enjoying all the content over there at CrimsonCast. Appreciate you taking the time today to join us on Podcast on the Brink. Have a great rest of your week and enjoy your time up in East Lansing.
As always, Alex, thanks for having me on. Appreciate it.
Thanks, everybody, as always, for listening to this week's episode of Podcast on the Brink. If you enjoy the show, please leave us a rating and a review over on Apple Podcasts and a 5-star rating over on Spotify. We'll be back soon with another episode of Podcast on the Brink.